Well, you know what? That's a great segue because I'm actually very curious about your compositional process. I, you know, again, what you've been able to do with the bass as a solo instrument is just like mind blowing to me. Like I had no idea, and that was those kind of things were possible. And it's not only that they are possible, but you make them sound so good. I mean, it's just like when you, I mean, the way that like Jimmy Page bends a note and it hits you at your soul. When you hit the detuners on your, I mean, it's like, it's one of those things that feels so good. And so I'm really curious about your compositional process. Do you make demos? How do you collect musical ideas? How do you put them together? When is a piece of music done in your eyes? Like, I'm really curious about the compositional process. How does it work for you?
Well, thank you for those very nice words and for asking about this. I mean, this is my passion. Composing is my absolute passion. I'm getting to the point where, it's time to think about retiring, whatever that means. And all I can think of is, all I want to do is compose music, sit around and compose music. It's just what I've always loved more than anything else my whole life. And so the process is kind of odd. I don't have a method particularly to compose, but if I did, it would be to follow the process that the ideas seem to suggest. So it's about having musical ideas and then letting those go through whatever process they seem to need to go through until they're done. And when they're done, it's kind of hard to know. I just always seem to reach a point where I go, okay, yeah, that's done. Kind of mysterious, and I don't really ask too many questions about that. Sometimes I do, but not always. So yeah, it's the specific method for any piece of music. Most of the music I write, I really do fuss over a lot. I have an idea, and I'm going to take that idea and try every permutation of it, every different incarnation of it I can think of, and see which is the very best way to present it. My way of thinking about music, I think, may be a little different from what a lot of your listeners may be used to. It seems very natural to me, but I have come to realize over the years that maybe it doesn't. It's not quite the same for other people. I take a pretty long view of my place in the continuum of music. So I kind of like to see myself as, where I exist in this as wide a lens of what music is as possible. So I try to use as many, I try to learn as much about music as possible from all over the world, from throughout history, and apply those ideas, techniques, inspirations as much as possible in the music I do. So it's a kind of a really trying to, to really stretch myself in the compositional process. So I'm using a lot of ideas that are kind of come from classical music. So a lot of what I write is thematic. So I'll have an idea, and certain ideas lend themselves to development. So if you have a musical idea, often it can be sometimes just a couple of notes, but not necessarily. There are lots of different ways that you can hear that set of notes working. You can, for instance, if you have three or four notes, you can take them and play them backwards, reverse the intervals. So you play that, you know, the inverse of what it is. You can transpose it. You can play it half as fast, twice as fast. You can use it as an accompaniment for itself in lots of different ways. All these kinds of things are possible in composing. And I love composing this way. I don't do this all the time. Some compositions are more just general ideas. So I'll just have sometimes like an effects patch will give me an idea of just a kind of sound I want to make, and I don't want to fuss over it too much. It's just kind of a general approach. these are all compositional approaches that have been used at various times throughout history, throughout cultures, and this is what I love to do. So there isn't really one specific method. It's more a matter of trying to find the right way of saying whatever it is I want to say at that moment. I hope that makes sense.
Well, there's a lot there, man. I definitely want to unpack some of those things. So, what kind of ideas can you maybe give me an example of this where you've taken some ideas from different cultures of the world and different methodologies and applied them to a composition? Can you give me an example of that in your own music?
Absolutely. So there's a piece on my latest record. The record is called Small Moments, and the piece is called There Is Nothing the Wind Cannot Blow Away, which is a phrase from a book I read in stories from the small landlocked country of Burkina Faso in West Africa. And I love the music from Burkina Faso. And I've been really lucky in that I've been able to play with some really great musicians from that country. And anytime I get to play with people like that, I ask them a lot of questions about their music and their approach and how things work. And I try to apply some of the ideas I learned from them in that music, but at the same time, I'm not trying to play folk music from Burkina Faso. I'm using it all in the context of other things that I understand. So at the same time, I used some phrasing in the melody for that piece that I learned from South Indian music. There's a way of moving rhythms across the frame of reference that's used in South Indian music, and I used that in the melody. And then I used a lot of electronics too, which is kind of coming from a different place entirely. So this is what I like to do, just kind of use these different ideas that I love and try to put them together in different ways because this is a reflection of who I am, right? I love all this music and trying to put it all together is is for me that's what I enjoy. It's a way of really being honest to myself.
And so what was that country you said that the that where you stole the idea from? What's that country called?
It's called Burkina Faso. It's two words.
Burkina
Burkina.
Faso.
Yeah, first word is Burkina.
Okay.
The second word is Faso, Burkina Faso.
So I have to ask, how did you find out about them and their music? And I mean, how did that's such an esoteric thing. You must be one of 5 people on Earth, and or at least in America, who know about this. How did you find out about this kind of music?
um, so I'm a really boring person. I have very few hobbies and I just love music and I have really spent my whole life learning as much about music as I could. And when I was a kid, I would go to the library and they had records there and you could check out the records. And I would check out any record I could, any record of music I could. If it was something I didn't know already, I would listen to it. And I became really fascinated with African music from Africa. Now, Africa is a continent, so it's a huge variation of music all over the continent. And it's kind of crazy to talk about African music, but there are certain kind of continuities that do make sense. And from that, I just got interested in studying the various aspects of the music. I in I've always worked with a lot of different musicians as well, and every time I meet new musicians, I try to find out what they're interested in and learn from them. And a lot of my musician friends were interested in African music as well, and so we would share recordings and share ideas. And I always did as much reading as I could. And yeah, I have a number of friends who are crazy fans for the music of Burkina Faso. One I should probably mention is my good buddy Lucas Ligeti, who's an amazing, amazing musician. He is the son of really one of the greatest composers of the 20th century, Georges Ligeti, who your listeners will probably know his father's music, Georges Ligeti's music, because Stanley Kubrick used it in most of his movies. In 2001, there's that really spooky sounding vocal music. That's George Ligeti's music. Atmospheres is the piece that Kubrick used for that, and he used. There's several other pieces that of Ligeti's music he used. So Georges Ligeti was, relatively well known for a 20th century composer. And right, Lucas is his son, and Lucas is a drummer, and comes from that kind of European classical music background, but also is interested in all kinds of other music too. And so we hit it off, big time. And he's kind of an expert in the music of Burkina Faso. He, I think he still goes every year to the country, and he put together a group of musicians from Burkina Faso with himself called Burkina Electric to explore the kind of meeting point between contemporary electronic composition. By that, I don't mean dance music, but kind of European, uh, uh, kind of intellectual
Yeah.
music, and the traditional music of Burkina Faso. So I learned a lot from him, and also from a lot of the musicians that he's worked with, but a lot of other musicians from Burkina Faso as well. All the countries in Africa, probably is better to say all the groups of people in Africa, have their own kind of different versions of how they think about music, and they're all really really interesting. They've been playing music for a long time there and have done really interesting things. Does that make sense?
No, that's awesome. I love how in depth you've gone on your study of Burkina Faso. I mean, that's really cool that you've like found people who've obsessed over that and then implemented that in your own music, and that it's just a good reminder, especially for us in the West here, that like music is worldwide, and there's more to the world than the top 40 radio.
I mean, it's so thrilling to be alive now and to have access to all this music, and more access as time goes on. As I said, for me, it was great to be able to go to the library and be able to check out, African music record, but also maybe a record of folk music from Bulgaria, and as well as lots of music from the European tradition, and learn about all that. But now it's even easier, right? You can just, go online and instantly, look up all this amazing music and get all this information about it as well. So for me, it's just been thrilling and just irresistible to try to find, this is really, maybe not the first generation for whom this has been possible, but certainly one of the first generations of musicians where you really have the possibility of exploring musical ideas from throughout the world, throughout time, and just trying to dip your toe into this idea of how to make sense of it all, because that's what's happening in the world, right? We don't really have Western culture and Eastern culture anymore. There's not a separate European culture. It's all just kind of one culture now. And so we have to kind of try to make sense of that. And being an artist, for me, that's just a thrill to try to do my little part of how we can piece this all together. And I'm not I don't I'm sure I'm making a ton of mistakes and doing things that would probably regret in time, but just the opportunity for me is what's most thrilling.
At what point does gear become a part of your compositional process? Because one of the things I absolutely love about you is you do use a lot of wild gear. You have the hyper bass, which is one of the wild. People, we'll throw a picture up here on the podcast, but I mean, it's one of the wildest bass. It's 3 octaves. It has a huge cutout. It's got, hip shots, detuners, everything. And you use gear and effects in very musical ways. Um, and I'm just curious, at what point does gear become a part of the compositional process for you?
That's such a great question, Banner, and I really appreciate you asking it. It is kind of interesting. So as you can tell, I spent a lot of time just thinking about music and processing musical ideas, and and this is an interesting one. Technology and music are always linked, right? As soon as, maybe not when people sang, But as soon as somebody hollowed out a log and hit it with a stick and went, "Oh, that sounds cool," that at one point was the height of technology in the world, and they made music with it right away. There was a considerable bit of time when the most complex machine in the world was a musical instrument. The church organs in Europe in, I think it was the 17th century, maybe 16th century, that was the most complex machine that existed in the world. So this idea of technology and music, they've always been really tightly linked. And our technology has enabled us to explore our innate musicality. This is what's really fascinating. Everything that we've found technologically, whether it was, that first hollowed out log or the latest, synthetic oscillator that somebody's coming up with in a lab, what these things do is they unlock in us our what's in us already, our innate ability to make music. These things aren't really kind of inventions as much as they're discoveries. So this is an idea that really fascinates me. And obviously we live at a time when we're at this technological kind of jump forward, right? Like the Industrial Revolution was one of those, and obviously we're in another one with kind of this digital revolution. And so, again, as an artist, this is really thrilling because it's a chance to try to make sense of what all this means and how we're going to process these. With each technological step we make, we have to figure out how we're going to deal with it. When you think when the first people, you know, discovered fire, that must have been a shock. It was really dangerous. Because you could just as easily burn down your whole habitat as you could make the food you were eating safe to eat. And it's kind of been that process all along. These technologies are always risky. Sometimes they cause us as much trouble as they help us. But music is a place where we can kind of work through those equations. And so for me, it's irresistible. The instrument I play is both electric and acoustic, in that the sound is made acoustically, but it's immediately captured electronically and can be processed electronically. So to me, it kind of represents this sense of old technology and new technology really married, really put together. And that allows me to explore these ideas of where this technology can go. So it's always been something I wanted to do, and it's something that's always, it's one other tool in the toolkit. So I can play in 12 different keys, or more keys if you want to get technical about it. And having the electronics is just like other keys you can play in. It's other tools that you can bring in to do this. And so that's always the process for me. The trick is not to let the technology dictate the process. I'm never happy if I feel like I've just let the machine or the technological device determine what I was going to do. But at the same time, there is kind of a dialogue with it. I'm looking at what options the technology makes available, and then I'm trying to think about how I can use that to say something I want to say. I hope that makes sense.
So how do you know when you've gone too far, when the gear is dictating the music? I mean, are there boundaries in your head? I mean, because I mean, your music gets pretty technical from a bass level, and it also gets very creative from the gear level. Um, and yet you tread that fine line where you're not showing off, but you are serving the music. I mean, how do you reel yourself in from turning it into a show off bass competition or a look what cool gear I have competition?
I mean, that's such a great question, Banner. I hate to answer it because any answer I give is going to be worse than the question by far, but I'll do my best. It's, I mean, that it's the question is the main thing. Is that's what I have to ask myself all the time. Okay, am I just letting the gear take over here, or am I using it as part of the creative process? And it has happened a couple times. This happened with me for looping, actually. I was really lucky in that sort of the first commercial looper that was available was made by the Lexicon Company, and I was working with them at the time, and so I got one of the first ones. And I was absolutely thrilled. For the people who don't know, a looper is a device that's made so you play a phrase of music into it and you step on a button and it plays that phrase back over and over, and then you can build on that in lots of interesting ways. And I was really thrilled by this and really jumped in with both feet right away. But after a couple of years, I felt like I wasn't really doing anything else with it. I I just felt like I wasn't really I was kind of letting it do what it wanted to do and not really I wasn't able to push it further. Now there are a number of people who work with loopers who are way more creative than I am and do amazing things. But for me, I kind of had to let it go. So now I very rarely use loopers anymore. Sometimes I do, but much less than I did initially. So yeah, it does happen. And how do you know when it happens? Yeah, you know, one thing about being an artist is that it's continually this process of trying to be honest with yourself. It's continually asking yourself, is this really am I really doing this because it's something I believe in, or am I doing this just to satisfy my own ego? Or am I doing this because I want somebody to think I'm cool? And even if the answer to those last two questions is yes, that doesn't mean it's off the table. It just means I have to take that into consideration. So yeah, it's a matter of just asking these questions and trying to guess when I've crossed a line that I don't want to cross.
I love that because, like I said, it's your music is not only technically amazing as a like I'm barely a bass player. I'm mostly a guitar player, but I've played bass in a few bands, and I can slap a little bit. But your music is so technically interesting. It's gear interesting, but at the same time, it's like someone who doesn't understand bass guitar can hear your music and be like, "Oh, that's moving. That's really cool." And that's why some of your stuff has millions of views on YouTube, because it is very moving stuff. And
Oh,
so the
thank
the
you. I'm
fact
so glad.
there's some of us out here, man. We're rooting for you. We're rooting for you. But no, I love that line. I love that you tug on that line and you write it, and it's why I think you're as interesting to me as credible as you are. I think is just because you do ride that line really well.
Thank you so much.
So